Hello, I'm continuing my reviews on the Exorcist series with Dominion, prequel to The Exorcist. Now, Dominion came out in 2005, and this is the second of two prequels to the 1973 classic The Exorcist, which of course was based on the novel The Exorcist by William Peter Blatty. Now, the first prequel to The Exorcist was the 2004 film Exorcist the Beginning, which was actually shot after this. Like, Exorcist the Beginning was actually a reshot version of this movie, because this movie was shot first, but Morgan Creek and Warner Brothers were not satisfied with this movie, so they hired Rennie Harlin to come in and reshoot the whole movie, and they also hired somebody to rewrite the script, and they basically remade this movie as Exorcist the Beginning, and they released that, but after that film failed miserably at the box office in 2005, they released this film, but when this film was released, I believe it only got a limited release. So, there are two prequels to The Exorcist, Exorcist the Beginning and this movie, and both films more or less have the same story to them, so really which one you count as canon really depends on which one you like better. Now, Dominion is directed by Paul Schrader. Now, I'm mainly familiar with Paul Schrader as a writer, because Paul Schrader actually wrote several of Martin Scorsese's movies, including Taxi Driver and The Last Temptation of Christ, but I haven't seen too many of Paul Schrader's movies, like the movies that he directed. The only other Paul Schrader movie, as in a movie that Paul Schrader directed, that I saw besides this was his 1982 remake of Cat People. Now, the screenplay for this movie is actually co-written by Caleb Carr, who is actually an author and a historian. Now, Caleb Carr wrote the novel The Alienist, which was a really good book, and Caleb Carr is a really good writer. First of all, I want to apologize for the dramatic change in lighting. I recorded the beginning of this review at night, but after I recorded those parts, I got tired and went to bed, so it's the morning now, and now I'm going to finish this review. Now, I said that this film and Exorcist the Beginning more or less have the same story. They do, but they're not exactly the same story. Like, they're on a basic level, they're the same story, but a lot of things happen differently. Like, they're not the exact same story. Like, the story for this film is very different for the story for Exorcist the Beginning, but they basically have more or less the same basic plot line. But the person who ends up getting possessed by the demon in this movie is completely different from the person who ended up getting possessed by the demon in Exorcist the Beginning. Now, the plot of Dominion is it actually begins in Holland in 1944, which was pretty much when the Second World War was coming to an end, at least in Europe, but a lot of Europe was still occupied by the Nazis. And in the beginning of the film, you see that a Nazi soldier ended up getting murdered, and now they're trying to figure out who murdered one of their soldiers, so they go to Father Mann, and they figure since he's a priest, maybe the person who committed this murder confessed it to him, so now they're trying to force Father Mann to point out the person who actually killed this Nazi soldier, and if he doesn't do this, they will shoot, like, a bunch of innocent people. So Father Mann, he's forced to point out the person who actually killed this Nazi, and just after witnessing all the horrible things that humans are capable of during the Second World War, he pretty much loses his faith in God. The movie then jumps ahead to 1947, and Mann is no longer a priest, he's actually an archaeologist, and he has to do this excavation of a church in East Africa that is literally buried, and he has to, like, dig it out, and when they open up the church, they discover that the church is actually built over something. It's actually built over this shrine to the devil. And it turns out that by opening up this church, they released an evil spirit which ends up taking possession of this boy named Cgi. And Cgi is this boy who has a lot of, like, physical deformities, like, he can't walk right. There's something wrong with, like, his arms and legs. I'm not really sure exactly what he has, but it also seems that he might be mentally challenged as well. But this evil spirit ends up possessing him, and when it does, a lot of his physical deformities end up going away. And in the movie, there's this priest named Father Francis who at first interprets this as a miracle, but it turns out it's not a miracle at all. It turns out that now this evil spirit is using Cgi's body, and his body is starting to become physically perfect, and it's implied that this spirit that is possessing Cgi is actually the spirit of Lucifer himself, because in the movie there's a certain point where they see this mosaic of the fallen angel Lucifer, and the image of Lucifer looks somewhat similar to the being that Cgi ends up changing into. And throughout the film, Mann starts to slowly regain his faith in God, and ultimately he has to perform an exorcism on Cgi to stop this demon, which might actually be Satan himself. And meanwhile, in the film, it also appears that a war might break out between the British Army and this, like, African tribe, because in the film, these, like, two British soldiers go into the church, and then they end up getting brutally murdered, and the general of this British Army blames the murder on somebody from the African tribe, so now it appears that a war might break out between this tribe and the British Army. Now, I enjoyed Dominion, but I will admit I actually had to watch this movie twice in order to really appreciate it, but I can honestly say that I do enjoy this film, and I do think on a storytelling level it is better than Exorcist the Beginning. Now, if you saw my review on Exorcist the Beginning, you would see that I actually did kind of like that movie. Like, I don't hate Exorcist the Beginning at all, but I do think on a storytelling level, this is a better film, and I do think it's a much better written film than Exorcist the Beginning was. Like, the thing about Exorcist the Beginning was, that was a really over-the-top and loud and bombastic kind of movie. This is a much quieter and much more subtle film, and Exorcist the Beginning was much more, like, in your face, while this is much more of a psychological horror film. And this film also tries to be much more of a character drama than Exorcist the Beginning was. Now, I did have some problems with this movie, but I want to get some of the positives about this movie out of the way before I really talk about the negatives about this movie. But one of the positives about this film is definitely Stellan Skarsgård as Mann. Now, Skarsgård also played Mann in Exorcist the Beginning, and just like in that film, he does a phenomenal job playing the character of Father Mann. Also, the person who plays Cgi in this movie, I believe the actor's name is Billy Crawford, and I believe he's actually a singer professionally, and he does a really good job as the character of Cgi. Now, of course, they use makeup for him, but the makeup for him is actually really good. Like, in the beginning, when you first see him, for a second, I actually thought they got an actor who 2 actually has a lot of the physical deformities that the character of Cgi has, but no, it's actually just makeup effects, and it's really good makeup effects, and I thought it was really cool when you see him get possessed by the demon, and you see all his physical deformities, like, disappear, and he becomes quote-unquote perfect. Like, I thought that was really interesting because in the original The Exorcist, when Regan got possessed by the demon, she would, like, mutilate herself, but in this it's, like, the exact opposite, which I thought was really interesting. I also thought it was really interesting that when the transformation, like, is complete, the demon says, "I am perfection," which I thought was interesting because it kind of ties back into the Lucifer myth, because supposedly, according to legend, Lucifer was God's favorite angel, and he was the most perfect of angels, so I thought that was really interesting. Once again, this is implying that this is not just any demon, but this is actually Lucifer himself. And I thought it was interesting, at the end you see the demon trying to tempt Father Merrin to turn against God, and you kind of saw a parallel between that and a story from the Bible of the devil trying to tempt Jesus to worship him instead of God. Like, you kind of saw a parallel between the biblical story and what happens in the film. I also really liked the opening sequence of this movie, where you see Father Merrin in Holland during World War II, and I thought it was a really well done opening sequence, and the opening sequence of this movie is a genuinely intense scene. Now, they had scenes similar to that in Exorcist the beginning, but in that, the Nazis were portrayed as, like, these two-dimensional, like, comic book villains, almost, where here it's done a little more three-dimensionally, and a little more realistically. Like, there is a legitimate reason that these Nazis are doing this in the beginning of the film. I mean, the Nazis were still terrible human beings, but I liked how in the beginning of this film, they portray it a little more three-dimensionally than they did in Exorcist the beginning. And I thought it was interesting that when you see that the British Army is blaming this African tribe for the murders of 2 of their men, and you see the general actually going out and trying to kill some of the members of this tribe, you see Merrin actually starting to kind of draw a parallel between what the Nazis did and what they're doing. Also, I really liked a lot of the themes that this movie touches on. Like, I feel like war is definitely a major theme within the film, and the atrocities of war, and really that's one of the reasons why Merrin lost his faith in God, because he felt like, how can God allow all this evil to happen in the world, and allow humans to do all these evil things to each other? And I also think prejudice is also a major theme in this film as well, because these British soldiers, like, obviously the reason they're mistreating this African tribe, like, a lot of it has to do with the fact that 2 British soldiers were murdered, but you also get the idea that if you consider the time that this movie takes place at, you also get the idea that there's a lot of prejudice, like, between these British soldiers and this African tribe. And I feel like this film really does touch on the themes of the nature of good and evil in man, which are themes that the original Exorcist touched on, and the film Exorcist 3 also touched on as well. And really the whole idea is that humans do evil things, and is it the devil that makes humans do evil things, or are humans just naturally evil, and the devil just feeds on the evil that is already there? So overall, I would say story-wise, Dominion, prequel to The Exorcist, has a really good story, and is a pretty well-written film, which isn't surprising considering it's co-written by Caleb Carr, who I think is a really good writer. Now, I do have some problems with this film, and my problems with this film is really how it's made, and I don't think it's really Paul Schrader's fault, because apparently Morgan Creek gave Paul Schrader a shit budget to work with, but a lot of the film, there are certain points in the film where it really does feel like I'm watching a made-for-TV movie, and a lot of that is the CGI effects in this film, which, dear God, are the CGI effects in this film freaking awful. Now, I'm not blaming Paul Schrader for that. Like, apparently, a lot of it had to do with the shit budget, and also, apparently they didn't get enough time to finish the effects, but, like, Exorcist the Beginning also had some pretty shitty CGI effects, but the thing about Exorcist the Beginning is the CGI in that, even though it wasn't that great, I could still see it being at least passable for a theatrical film. The CGI in this film looks like something out of the Langoliers. So I would say that's my biggest problem with this film, is it really does kind of feel like, at points, a made-for-TV movie. Like, you can tell this film has a very low budget. Like, and it's ironic, because Exorcist the Beginning, you could tell had a pretty big budget, and Exorcist the Beginning was a pretty well-made movie, where this film has a better story than Exorcist the Beginning, but it's not as well made. And I'm not blaming Paul Schrader for that. Once again, there was a lot of problems with the budget and things like that. So overall, script-wise, I would say Dominion is better than Exorcist the Beginning, but I personally recommend both films because I actually don't hate Exorcist the Beginning, and I feel like both films are good in their own ways. Now, when this movie came out, I believe the reviews were actually pretty negative, the same as Exorcist the Beginning. However, William Peter Blatty, who wrote the original Exorcist novel, was actually a pretty big fan of this movie. Like, he actually gave this film some pretty high praise, and I know film critic Roger Ebert also really liked this movie as well. There's actually a review right on the DVD cover here, where Roger Ebert calls this a milestone in movie history. I mean, it was a good movie, but that might be a bit of an over-exaggeration, but then again, everybody has their own opinions. Now, how I feel about the whole franchise overall, the original The Exorcist is a mandatory classic. Like, if you're a horror fan, it's almost a mandatory film to see if you're a horror fan. But even if you're not a horror fan, it's still a film that if you're a fan of cinema in general, you have to see, because to me it's one of those quintessential films of the early 1970s. It's right up there with films like The Godfather and Jaws and Star Wars. Like, it's not just one of the greatest horror films ever made, but it's one of the greatest films of any genre. Now, Exorcist 2: The Heretic is a worthless piece of crap. I honestly recommend skipping over that one. And in 1980, you had the film The Ninth Configuration, which was kind of a spin-off of The Exorcist because it featured one of the same characters. Now, I didn't review that one because it's actually not a horror film, and this is the month of October where I only review horror films, so I didn't review that one, but I do highly recommend The Ninth Configuration, and like I said, it is a spin-off of The Exorcist, even though it's not a horror film. And then you had The Exorcist 3, which is an underrated classic, in my opinion. And then you had the two prequels to The Exorcist, Exorcist the Beginning and this movie, and truthfully, I recommend both films. I mean, both films have their strengths, and both have their weaknesses, but I will say, story-wise, Dominion Dominion is a better film than Exorcist the Beginning. But really, the films that I recommend overall in this franchise would be the original, The Ninth Configuration, and Exorcist 3. To me, that is the definitive trilogy of this franchise. Like, those are the three films that I recommend you see above any of the other films in this series. And I also recommend reading the 3 books that inspired those 3 films. So, now that I'm done reviewing the Exorcist franchise, the next horror franchise I'm going to review for Horror Month is the Jaws series, which of course began with Steven Spielberg's 1975 classic Jaws, and that's going to be my next movie review. Now, I actually already recorded my review of Jaws, and that review is actually going to be somewhat special because after my review in that video, I'm gonna show a bunch of mini reviews that my friends recorded for that movie, and I'm gonna show my friends' reviews on the film after my review in that video, so make sure you watch it all the way through so you can also hear some of my friends' opinions on that film. But yeah, my next movie review will be Jaws, and that was my review of Dominion, prequel to The Exorcist, and bye.